You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. The day the world changed. That was one of the headlines in one British newspaper after the Twin Towers attack 13 years ago today. If you hadn't heard of Al-Qaeda by then, after 9/11, you certainly did. Those numbers themselves not just etched on the world's memory, but figures which now stand as a symbol of a civilisational struggle that we are fighting to this day. It spawned the catchphrase, the war on terror. Two actual wars, one in Afghanistan and one in Iraq, ensued, as did a host of franchises that now exist throughout the world, from Western Africa to the Middle East via the Horn of Africa. From the march of Boko Haram in Nigeria, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, the Shabbab militia in the Horn of Africa, they are just some of the versions of this movement which aims to install a global caliphate under Sharia law. But of course this year has seen the inexorable rise of the group which now calls itself the Islamic State. Its brutality and savageness has shocked the world, and the prospective genocide of a sect in Iraq known as the Yazidis left the world and the West wondering just how to tackle it. Even this week, Abu Qatada, once described as Osama bin Laden's right-hand man in Europe, said the beheading of journalists undertaken by IS was against Islam. It highlights a split between IS and the previously dominant global strand of Jihad known as Al-Qaeda. So 13 years on from 9/11, where is Al-Qaeda? Where is its cause? What about the West and its fight against it? Well, to discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm pleased to be joined by the American commentator Charlie Wolf. Also here in the studio is Samir Dathi. He's a national officer of the Stop the War Coalition. And on the line, Matthew Jamison, a consultant fellow at Royal United Services Institute. Warm welcome to you all. Charlie, 13 years on from 9/11. In hindsight, what do you think would have been a better response to the 9/11 attacks? We've had two wars and a pretty dominant global jihadi movement. It hasn't gone away.
I still maintain that it was the right response. I think post the response, there were obviously mistakes made, but you'll find that in any war. But I think, this was obviously a monumental event, especially in my lifetime. I can't think of anything unless you go back prior generations to Pearl Harbor. It had to be responded, and we did respond, and thankfully, we're 13 years later, there hasn't been another major attack on American soil. There's always the danger of it, but we've put infrastructure in place, and I think America is safer. I don't think we're necessarily where we want to be under Mr. Obama. I'm sure we'll discuss that later. But yes, when someone makes an attack of that level, you have to respond. And I think again, something we'll get into later, I think when you don't respond, as we've seen with Syria and the rise of ISIL, or ISIS as they're known, you see what happens. So I think the case has been somewhat proven.
Matthew, what's your take on that? Charlie's saying that America is safer, but there is a sense that the global jihadist movement is more virulent since 9/11.
Well, it certainly, I think, it has become more virulent. However, I do agree with Charlie's broad analysis. I think that the approach that was taken in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 by the Bush administration to go after Al-Qaeda and its affiliates aggressively and vigorously wherever they may be, starting with the Afghanistan base where the Taliban was hosting them, was the only thing that the Americans really could have done in response to 9/11. To a large extent, they have been very successful over the last decade. Core Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan has virtually, most of it has been ground down and crushed, and you're just dealing now with the remnants of the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban. However, there has now been this franchise has taken off. Al-Qaeda is not a monolithic group. There's no one organization made up of everybody called Al-Qaeda. It is a fluid, organic entity that spawns off into many different spin-offs. So you may have a group of disaffected radical Islamists in a North African country, or you may have them in Europe. But what unites them is this common Wahhabist, Sunni extremist ideology, which was originally Al-Qaeda's, and that is the legacy of Al-Qaeda still, the ideology, and the growth of the Islamic State from Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Unfortunately, the approach that the Bush administration adopted in the beginning, in the first phase against Afghanistan and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda was correct. However, I think we all now would agree, anybody of any rational sense, I myself was a very big supporter of the intervention to get rid of Saddam Hussein. I now think that it was probably one of the greatest foreign policy mistakes of the last 50 years at least. I'm very disappointed with how the whole thing was managed and handled and what we were told. And I think actually now that has actually created a greater problem in terms of Islamic fundamentalism.
Indeed, and on the Afghanistan point, though, Samir, we have two guests here who say that the military action in Afghanistan was effective. Would you agree with that?
No, not effective at all. Taliban continue to be a formidable fighting force, subsidised by opium, subsidised by minerals. Afghanistan is in a state of chaos. The Taliban have spread and become more virulent in Pakistan. As a result of the war on terror, Al-Qaeda has spread. It wasn't in Iraq, but now it is. It's spread into the Arab Peninsula.
So was the US wrong to approach Afghanistan as...
Absolutely, yes. There should have been no interventions whatsoever.
So after 9/11, what would, say, Stop the War coalition's position on an American response, an effective American response to 9/11?
Well, we were against any interventions whatsoever. I mean, we think that 9/11, as disgusting and grotesque as it was, didn't come out of nowhere. It came as it was blowback, as the CIA have said. It came off the back of a century of cruel and cynical foreign policy by America and its allies in the West, in the Middle East, coups, backing dictators, selling weapons to grotesque, tyrannical leaders, backing Israel, invading or engaging in a proxy war in the 80s in Afghanistan, sanctions against Iraq, killing 1 million people, half of them children, just crime after crime after crime. That's where 9/11 came from.
I think that's a bit of a fallacy, unfortunately. I think, it's also that sort of the liberal view of blame the victim, or the so-called oppressed. There's always things.
Well, that's what you were doing with 9/11. You said the victims, Americans, we have to go and we got to attack. We got to attack the Arabs. We got to attack the Afghans.
No, we weren't attacking the Arabs and attacking the Afghans. We were attacking.
1 million people died in Iraq.
Yes, but remember there was also a war going on, and this thing didn't happen in a vacuum. There's this view you seem to have that America is controlling the world and everything else had no bearing on things. I think that people that fly airplanes into buildings bear some responsibility, and those that send them in bear some responsibility, and there should be some sort of a seeking of justice, just seeking of justice, but preventing future attacks.
But the people who flew the planes into the buildings had Saudi passports. Yeah, Saudi Arabia wasn't targeted.
No, but they were acting for Al-Qaeda, which was based in, of course, Afghanistan under the Taliban. So it wasn't a war necessarily against the Afghans. It was a war to eradicate the Taliban, which, of course, were holding Afghans essentially hostage, and to eradicate Al-Qaeda, which was what happened.
No, the purpose of the intervention in Afghanistan had nothing to do with helping anyone. I mean, as you pointed out, there are Saudi jihadists in the planes, but we back Saudi Arabia. We act not in accordance with justice. We act in accordance with our perceived economic and strategic interests, and to hell with anyone who stands in our way. Look at the Bahraini revolutionaries who've been crushed with our support. This has got nothing to do with justice whatsoever. It's a lie.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. We're discussing Al-Qaeda 13 years on from the 9/11 attacks with Charlie Wolf, Samir Dathi and Matthew Jamison. I suppose, Matthew, the problem is that if war was declared, or at least there was a response in Afghanistan following 9/11, but you're not really tackling the real issue, which was the fact that the terrorists were from Saudi Arabia. It was a war on terror that was never going to be won.
I don't understand the position that no intervention can be undertaken whatsoever, even in self-defense. That just seems totally naive. Saudi Arabia is, of course, a tremendous problem. Where does all of this evil, warped poison that the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda believe in come from? It comes from Saudi Arabia. It comes from the Wahhabis. And unfortunately, we're going to have to look at reevaluating that relationship, because the Stop the War coalition person made the accurate point that Unfortunately, yes, the West has engaged in alliances with repressive regimes in the Middle East. However, the best course of action in the Middle East is to promote democracy and human rights, not to work with these repressive regimes. So we have to be encouraging these regimes to change. Secondly, it was correct to have to go into Afghanistan and deal with al-Qaeda there. And that has actually been largely successful. There has not been another major 9/11 style attack in the United States. Therefore, that must be considered a success. However, this was not blowback. I'm terribly sorry, but that's a terribly simplistic, indeed utterly preposterous thing to say. It was the Soviet Union that invaded Afghanistan in the 1980s, not the CIA. The CIA assisted the Afghan rebels who were fighting against the Soviet invaders. So let's be very clear about that. Also, I don't understand all this blowback about before 9/11. What countries was the United States invading in the Middle East before 9/11? Nothing. No countries.
Now that's a simplistic view, because it's not about invasions necessarily. It's about hegemony. It's about American hegemony in the region. It's about
what hegemony? What colony do we have?
It's about.
There were no countries that the United States was occupying in the Middle East before 9/11.
Well, that's a very simplistic attitude, because
what country was the United States occupying in the Middle East before 9/11?
Imperialism
There was no military intervention in any Middle Eastern country.
Imperialism does not operate simply in terms of occupations. Now that's a very neocon simplistic view. The way imperialism works, it can work economically, it can work through military bases, it can work through alliances, it can work through selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, to Bahrain, giving weapons to Israel, with which it uses to crush and suppress and humiliate the Palestinians. It can be backing Mubarak.
A bit of fantasy.
Sorry, could I just ask?
How is any of that fantasy?
Matthew, go ahead, Matthew.
So you think then, the response then, in your mind, all these terrible things in terms of imperialism that are being done by the West, if we are to believe that, then you believe that the proper response is for men to fly airplanes into buildings.
Well, no, that's a straw man argument, because I never suggested that.
Well, no, but do you agree that that's the correct response? No.
Of course I don't.
So therefore, whatever the West is doing, this
must be correct,
therefore,
by your
this is
terms.
not the appropriate response from Islamic fundamentalists. They cannot fly they cannot fly planes, civilian airliners, into buildings. I mean, people who do that are psychopaths.
Of course, we're all in agreement on that.
Charlie, can I just bring you in?
I just want to clarify that point, because I was very confused. I was almost thinking you were justifying this blowback.
Point clarified. But Charlie, the broader point of what Samir is saying, it was bloodying the nose of America. It was an unhappiness with them. It may have stemmed from American foreign policy, but this has been building for decades and decades.
But this is not how you, as Matthew was saying, that's not how you carry out foreign relations. You don't attack civilians. If you wanted to declare a war and fight it on a battlefield. But to use this excuse of foreign affairs, there's always things happening in foreign affairs, and there's always someone somewhere on the planet that's going to feel oppressed or wronged or whatever. So I think that's just an excuse, to be quite frank. It was an evil action, and it needed to be responded to. And again, I fear, had it not been responded to, then it would have been worse. There would have probably been more attacks, because one of the things that bad actors realize, and if you come forward to the present day, is when there is no strength, when there's no leadership shown in the world, as Reagan called it, peace through strength, then bad actors know they can get away with murder.
So was George Bush right to coin this term, war on terror?
I think it's, by the fact that we all still use it, seems to make it right. Listen, if he had the time to do focus groups, then maybe they would have come up with something else. But this is the term that seemed to have come up. And, is it the best term in the world? Maybe, maybe not. But to me, I think there are more important items.
Would you accept that that the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have radicalized and enfranchised jihadi movements across the world? If there hadn't been, say, for instance, an invasion in Iraq, moving away from Afghanistan, we may not see the fundamentalist violence that we're seeing in Boko Haram and Shabbab and Jabhat al-Nusra.
That's a hard one to answer, but I think in some respects the studies I've read in the past, everybody likes to use the term recruiting sergeant for terror. In actual fact, the real recruiting sergeant isn't supposed aggression. It's when a bad actor is winning. 9/11 was the recruiting sergeant for terror. Everybody wants to join the winning team. What they don't want to join is the team that's going to get them killed. So I think that the response actually is, in many ways, tampered down jihadis. I mean, there will always be jihadis. There will always be someone with a gripe. There will always be people that want to murder for the sake of murder, and they will latch on to somewhere that gives them that opportunity to do so and feel like they have a cause behind them.
Can I make a quick comment? I mean, Charlie and Matthew have made some remarks that the attacks against Afghanistan and Iraq were successful because there hasn't been a subsequent Islamist attack in America. Of course, there was an Islamist attack in London on 7/7. There hadn't been an Islamist terrorist attack in this country since Lockerbie in 1988. And then as a result of our intervention, there was an Islamist attack. Now, this is not some raving lefty position. The former head of MI5 gave evidence, Dame Elizabeth Manningham Buller gave evidence in 2011 to the Chilcot inquiry, and she said that she had advised Blair's government in 2001 that if you intervene in this adventure in the Middle East, you will make us less safe, not more safe. And she was absolutely right. There was an Islamist attack. This has created terrorism. Terrorism cannot be defeated through bombs, tanks, guns. Terrorism is the product of socioeconomic despair, the consequence of decades of imperialism, colonialism, and the way you stamp it out is a political solution, not by neocon bombs.
But wait a minute, the political solution was part of it. If you'll remember, Bush actually went into this with an agenda, and his agenda was the freedom agenda. You know, the theory that
it was the cowboy agenda. That's what it was.
No, it was the theory that free peoples do not have reason to go to war with other free peoples. He was feeling that you had a people in the Afghanis who were oppressed by the Taliban, and the removal of the Taliban would at least give the Afghanis a chance. Now, it was up to them whether it would be successful or not, but at least they had a chance.
America tries to engage in coups against democratically elected governments all the time.
The Taliban wasn't democratically elected.
Well, Chavez was democratically elected, wasn't he?
In the Middle East, the problem here is where all this terrorism, this Islamic fundamentalist fanaticism is coming from is if you look at the Middle East, it's one of the most undemocratic regions in the world. There are, apart from Israel, there is no real democracy in the region. Saudi Arabia isn't a democracy. Egypt is certainly now not a democracy. All the Gulf states.
Who we support.
So the women's rights are appalling. The human rights are appalling.
Yeah, we support that.
Therefore, you have a region which is got terrible governance.
And yet, when the Arab people rose up, against their governments, we did everything we could to destroy that revolution.
That is why the people in the Middle East, in Egypt, in Libya, in Tunisia, are rising up and throwing off their dictators, not the West's rulers. Not the Cameron government, not the Obama administration. It's the Colonel Gaddafi's. It's the other dictators in Egypt, like Mubarak. It is these people, the ordinary Arab civilians, do not have any participation in their government. Who are they fighting in Syria? It is a Arab government. It is an Alawite government. And this is the thing. You go on about the West. Actually, there is more Muslim on Muslim violence. More Muslims kill Muslims in Pakistan than have been killed by the West. Actually, more Muslims have died over the last decade at the hands of fellow Muslims than by the West. And therefore, there is a problem in Islam and in the Islamic Muslim world. And there is a clash between modernity, Muslims, Arabs who want a democratic government, who want women's rights, who want gay rights, who want rights for minorities, who want to be part of a democratic process and want their rulers to be elected and held accountable.
Okay.
And then you have the Islamic fanatics who are against democracy, who want a caliphate, who want to rule by Sharia law, as we are seeing.
And they use the oppression argument as a way to further these means. In many regards, you have corrupt government. Let's look at Gaza, for instance, in Hamas. You have a corrupt government there that came to power by throwing people off of buildings. And it's a great way to sit there and find a bogeyman, if you want, in the Israelis, when in fact it's Hamas that have made the problem for the Gazans, it's not the Israelis.
There is a sense with the rise of the Islamic State, and I want to bring you into this, Matthew, again, ISIS or ISIL or IS or whichever you like to call it, have they overtaken Al-Qaeda as the global jihadi brand? And what do you put their success, if we can call it that, down to?
They, of course, emerged out of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And there is one point where I feel I may have some agreement with the person from the Stop the War Coalition, because I personally feel now, actually, we had to deal with Afghanistan, but Iraq, actually, I mean, the way it was handled and has been managed has been nothing short of a catastrophe. And, of course, there weren't very many Islamic fundamentalists operating in Iraq before 2003, because Saddam Hussein was a secular Arab nationalist dictator, and he ran a very, very tight totalitarian ship. He would never, ever have allowed any Islamic insurrection. He would have stamped it out, like in Syria in 1982, what they did there. So this vacuum that opened up after the invasion, when you had every single jihadist from around the world basically trying to pour into Iraq to fight, created, of course, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and now the Islamic State has emerged from that. They have about 17,000 fighters. They are getting a lot of money from the sale of oil in Iraq and Syria, from money that they have stolen in Iraq and Syria.
But do you think that their aspirations are a bit more realistic than Al-Qaeda's aspirations, because they are very much a regional group, and that's perhaps what their success lies with?
Well, actually, they're even more dangerous than Al-Qaeda, because you see the difference. I mean, Al-Qaeda was a loose network, and it was not a threat in comparison to something like the Soviet Union. That was a superpower, and that was a state, and that was a massive machine behind it, a whole nation. However, Al-Qaeda was just a terrorist network. And so ISIS is actually now in the process of building the infrastructure of a state, and they have seized quite a lot of territory, and that's what makes them far more dangerous than Al-Qaeda, because they are now in the process of actually creating their own state machinery.
Indeed,
even though they are, as Matthew said, a regional entity, the problem, of course, is they do have people with British and American or European passports that are being trained up in jihad that could come back to the United States, United Kingdom, and freelance, if that's the term. I can respect Matthew's point vis-a-vis Iraq. I personally still think it was right to go in, and I think where the mistakes were made, obviously, after the initial battle, that was done very well. If you think about it, I think we had captured Iraq in under 3 weeks. Then you went through a period of confusion, and a lot of mistakes were made in the running of Iraq. However, when Iraq was handed over to the Obama administration after the surge, things were actually better. I mean, even Mr. Obama took credit for that. Where we've messed up, and I think this is what has led to groups like ISIL, was, of course, in not negotiating a status of forces agreement. This is where Mr. Obama really messed up. We did not keep people in the area to protect the blood and treasure that we had lost, to protect what had been gained. I think, again, the way Syria was handled. Now, you can argue whether it was right to set a red line or not, but when the President of the United States sets a red line, he has to respect it. This is the leader of the free world. By not respecting his own red line, sends out a message to the rest of the world, to the ISILs, to the Putins of the world, etc., saying this man is not serious. So this is partly what has led to the situation we're in now.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. We're discussing the position of Al-Qaeda 13 years on from the 9/11 attacks. With me in the studio is the American commentator Charlie Wolf. Also here is Samir Dathi, who is a national officer for the Stop the War Coalition. And Matthew Jamison is on the line. He's a consultant fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Samir, is there a moral case to intervene and tackle IS, especially when they're threatening the genocide of the Yazidi sect? They're killing and beheading journalists.
Well, that presupposes that states are moral actors and that foreign policy is a moral enterprise, which I don't think it is. I think foreign policy is
self-interest.
Is amoral. It's not based on morality, which is why the Americans crushed a revolution in Bahrain.
So it's about strategic interest. What's in the strategic interest?
The strategic interest in Iraq. Well, I mean, the strategic interest in respect to the Middle East is clear, and everyone knows it. It's absolutely full of oil and resources and plenty of markets. And the West want to control that very, very important region. This has been the case for the last 100 years since oil became the ascendant commodity.
I appreciate that, but just on the IS point, should Britain, should the coalition of the willing, that term hasn't gone away, unfortunately, go and tackle ISIS?
No, I don't think it should, because there's a simple question: will it make things better or worse? And I think all you have to do is look at history, and you will see that you cannot get rid of terrorism by bombing. This is so rudimentary. I'm astounded that intelligent men...
Can I ask, with all honesty and sincerity, what would you do as far as ISIS is concerned? How would you, say, when you see what's happening to the Yazidis, etc.?
There are no quick fix answers.
No, I agree with that, but what would you do?
We have to stay out of the Middle East because I believe that our interference in the Middle East is wholly nefarious, wholly corrosive. There is no morality in it.
But meanwhile, whether
we
there
want
is or
to
there
protect
isn't,
our interests.
But whether there is or isn't morality, the fact that the Yazidis are getting murdered left, right, and center, what would you...
More people will die as a result of our intervention, and that's quite simple. Every time you drop a bomb, you recruit more terrorists. I mean, the one few things that Tony Blair did, which was good, was the Good Friday Agreement, where after years and years of Irish terrorism, he sat down and he reached a political settlement. Now that
only came because the Irish or the IRA were in a position where they knew they couldn't win, and they had to switch to a political decision. But what do you do when the other actor does not want to negotiate?
We have to stay out of the Middle East.
Okay,
altogether.
well, can I bring in Matthew again? Because Barack Obama spoke last night. He said he would not hesitate to take action against IS militants in Syria as well as Iraq. So I guess first of all, what's your response to that? I mean, this time he doesn't need the approval of Congress. Is this a good move? He's effectively going to do in Syria what Congress wouldn't let him do last year.
Well, first of all, we don't really know, actually, if Congress would have approved it because it never did get to a vote, so it would be speculation. And secondly, I really feel as though the President, this is the only option he has, really. I mean, I'm deeply disturbed by the moral relativism and the lack of moral clarity on display from your Stop the War Coalition spokesman, because any individual who has a very strong moral compass wouldn't hesitate to say that the Islamic State is an evil, perverse...
Well, I said that at the very outset.
I'm speaking...
Can you stop misrepresenting me?
Okay, go ahead, Matthew.
We need to take action against them. Now, you have said we need to stay away. We need to keep out. We don't do anything. However, other people who watch the television and see children being raped, women being raped,
demagoguery. Is that your argument?
People's heads being hacked off, whole communities being wiped out.
Let's talk about the Israeli crimes. Let's talk about Fallujah 2004. Let's talk about the million Iraqis killed.
Okay, so
you're the one engaged in moral relativism.
Samir, just let Matthew finish.
Whitewash American crimes. You're whitewashing American crimes.
Cannot allow such psychopathic barbarity. It is totally in contradiction to every single civilized human value.
Charlie, just your response to Barack Obama's statement this week, last night. In a way, I mean, I guess you could say he was elected because of... Well, he was in part because he was seen as a non-war president. I mean, there was fervent opposition to the Iraq war. You could argue it's a speech he probably didn't want to make yesterday. No. But you'd be pleased because this is America showing its might and showing that it's doing something.
But unfortunately, it's hard to believe him because actions have to speak louder than words. I mean, some of the positions were major changes from even a week ago. Now he's suddenly all gung-ho. But even then, you don't signal to an enemy what you're not going to do. I don't remember Churchill saying we shall fight them in the air and on the beaches and in the land and in the fields. We shall never put boots on the ground. I wish him well. I think we need to go in. But he talks about a coalition of the willing when he's got 9 members of this coalition so far. Bush went in with, I think it was 37 on the coalition. We don't know what these people are going to contribute. So I am a bit worried, but yes, I think ISIL needs to be taken care of. They need to be excised. They are a cancer and they need to be gotten rid of.
And how will this go down among Americans? I mean, is the threat of IS quite abstract for them, or did something change with the murder of Steven Sotloff?
That's the interesting thing. Mr. Obama is being led from behind, or leading from behind in response to the American people. This had nothing necessarily to do with the Yazidis or any of the past events. It's when the polling changed, and the polling changed when we had Foley and then Sotloff murdered on video. In some respect, this is where terrorists are sometimes their own worst enemies. You know, Al-Qaeda bringing down a whole building woke up the sleeping bear. The ISIL hacking off people's heads, again, woke the sleeping bear, and the American people wanted action. So they don't necessarily trust Mr. Obama as a leader. He's looking at the polling, and he feels he has to respond.
Can I make a comment?
Go ahead, Samir.
It's only because it's a typical obfuscatory tactic of people who are pro-war to suggest that anyone who opposes war must be therefore pro-ISIS, pro-Al-Qaeda, pro-Assad. Let me finish. I absolutely despise and condemn Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and so on and so forth, as does every single person in the Stop the War Coalition. The reason why we focus on Western policy is because we live in the West. Our government is accountable to us. We have control over our government, and it's therefore incumbent on us to put pressure on our own governments to reverse its cruel and cynical policy in the Middle East. That's why we focus on the West. It's bluster for me. It would be bluster for me to sit here and condemn these feckless, horrible Muslims and talk about the cancer of Islam and all the rest of it. That would just be bluster. I'm an activist. I want to change the world for the better, so I focus on what I can do in practice, and that's opposing my own government's imperialism.
Okay, and you've made that clear. But just getting back to Barack Obama's speech yesterday, Matthew, just your take on, I mean, with the view that there's going to be no boots on the ground, I mean, is it a good idea to outsource your military action to, say, the Peshmerga forces?
Well, I think actually, in a way, this concept of leading from behind, there is some merit to it. Personally, I feel as though the Obama foreign policy is really, is all over the place, and quite frankly, everybody can now see that President Obama is way out of his depth. He is an amateur on the world stage. People, I think, are waking up to the fact that someone like Hillary Clinton would have been a much, much more experienced, tougher operator on the world stage.
I can agree to that as a Republican, even.
Yeah. Well, I therefore feel as though really the president's speech laying out the action that he's going to have to take in Syria and Iraq, he's going to really have to follow through on that, because he made such a hash of it last year with the red lines, and his credibility has been shot. He's going to have to stick to that position. But, it's no good. You see, President Obama is taking the right course in terms of mixing, getting involved more of these Middle East states, because at the end of the day, as I come back, the problems here are in Middle Eastern countries, in Arab countries, or in Muslim countries. And as I've said, there have been more Muslims killed by fellow Muslims over the last decade. There's clearly a problem within the world of Islam. There is a battle going on between moderate Islam and those who want to hijack Islam and who do not speak for Islam. But the problem is that you can't say you're against all these things, but you don't want to do anything about it, that you're quite content to allow this cancer to continue to grow and not do anything about it. It would be like somebody who has cancer and the doctor says, that's dreadful, but I'm not going to do anything to help you. I'm not going to operate to take it out. And that's exactly what your Stop the War Coalition person's position is. Okay. And therefore, you've got to do something, and you've got to take a position and tackle it head on. Because as Sir Edmund Burke said, the only thing for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing.
Now, we're running out of time, and I want to get one more contribution from all of you. Charlie, 13 years on from 9/11, some in Washington are predicting a 50-year war against terrorism. I'm just wondering, do you think we've learnt lessons from the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq? Is the West tackling al-Qaeda in a way that it wasn't more than a decade and a half ago?
I think you're always learning, and you'll always continue to learn, and you'll always make mistakes, and you'll always have new scenarios. I mean, if you think back again, it's easy to criticize a lot of what the Bush administration did. It was interesting. I was at a function with John Bellinger recently, who was, of course, the legal counsel for the State Department. And, it's easy to criticize things like Guantanamo and what have you, but as he said at the time, people didn't realize there were no laws on the books. We hadn't had something like international terrorism, putting planes into buildings, etc. They were, yes, making some of this up as they had to go along. There were no laws to try these people. So it's easy to sit and criticize. And yes, I'm sure some of it was gotten wrong. But again, this was brand new territory that we had gotten into. So we have learned some things, but you never know as the world changes and unfolds what the next thing may bring to us.
Samir, I mean, what do you think 13 years on from 9/11? Is there another way of making the world safer rather than military action? I mean, you must have a view on that.
Absolutely, and we're not nihilists. We don't want to do nothing, but we think that emancipation comes from below, comes from people rising up and establishing a country that meets their basic human needs, their well-being. We don't think that emancipation comes from through high explosives being dropped from jets. That's not the intention of wars, and that's not what it achieves. The West's role has been wholly corrosive. It co-opted, it destroyed largely the Arab uprisings. But what we need are people rising up, freeing themselves from the shackles of neocolonialism and establishing states which meet their own needs and not the interests of corporations and industrialists and war generals.
Matthew, can I just get your view? We're talking about this kind of creative tension between ISIS and al-Qaeda. Do you think al-Qaeda will get back into the ascendancy, or do you think IS will overtake and take over the global jihadist brand?
Well, I don't really think it's actually... that's not really the issue. That's not the point, because at the end of the day, they are one and the same in many respects, and they are two halves of the same coin. There might be different people, there might be different players, they may come from different areas, but their ideology is very much the same.
Although Abu Qatada this week criticised IS, didn't he? And al-Zawahiri has set up a franchise in India, so there is a kind of battle between them, isn't there?
Yes, but I mean that's really just internal politics about who's going to be the bigger man. I mean this is all about ego. I mean it's like they're saying I'm more fanatical than you. I mean really at the end of the day what it is it's all very much the same thing, which is they hate democracy, they hate women's rights, they hate gay rights, they hate Jews, they hate any Muslim that doesn't conform to their warped perspective, they hate Westerners, and they won't be satisfied until they have created their extreme caliphate. Now, I feel as though at the end of the day, you can't take this on militarily. You can only do so much militarily. This is about a battle of hearts and minds. And the best response against this is the Arab Spring, actually. It is the Arab people on the ground rising up and saying we want a democratic government and we want liberal human rights. We don't want this Sharia dictatorship. We don't want this Islamic theocracy. We don't want this military Mubarak-style dictatorship. We want actually what you in the West have. We want elections every 4 years. We want political parties.
The Americans
we want
won't let that happen. It's arming SCAF in Egypt right now.
The what, sorry?
America won't let that happen. It's arming SCAF in Egypt, which is slaughtering hundreds and hundreds of protesters. That's not going to happen whilst America has its grubby hands on the Middle East.
Well, I don't support any action that does not support democratic universal human rights. So if that is going on, I would condemn that.
So, well, that's a good place to leave it. The fight for democracy continues. Gentlemen, many thanks. That's Matthew Jamison, Consultant Fellow at RUSI, on the line there. Here in the studio, Samir Dathi, National Officer for the Stop the War Coalition, and also here in the studio, the American commentator Charlie Wolf. Many thanks for joining me. Brendan Cole on The Voice of Russia in London.